The city of New York never truly sleeps, yet on certain nights, it reveals a side far removed from its bustling daytime persona. Under a blanket of fog and the pallid glow of a waning moon, deserted roads and empty tunnels become stages for unspeakable encounters. This is the night Ethan Reyes, a quiet 20-year-old college student, finds himself hurtling into an inescapable nightmare, where every mile deepens his isolation, and every shadow hides a threat. Ethan Reyes, with his lean frame and contemplative eyes, had always preferred solitude. Recently grappling with grief over a personal loss and the relentless pressure of college life, he sought refuge in long solitary drives through the rarely traversed parts of New York City. Tonight, as he left his cramped apartment in Queens, the city seemed eerily transformed. The familiar urban roar was replaced by an unsettling quiet, a silence that spoke of secrets hidden in the night. Driving along rain-slicked roads, Ethan's car headlights cut through a thick, shifting fog. Every reflection in the window appeared distorted, as if reality itself were fraying at the edges. The familiar hum of the engine was joined by a low, persistent static emanating from the car radio. Unable to recall when he had last tuned into such a channel, he found himself fixated on a frequency that played soft, indecipherable murmurs. It was as though the voices were trying to convey a message, but their meaning remained elusive. As he navigated the winding streets near abandoned industrial areas, Ethan noticed a peculiar road sign, its letters half eroded by time, glowing faintly in the mist. Midnight Loop. For a fleeting moment, a chill ran down his spine. Was it a coincidence, or had fate already set its design? With a deep breath, he pressed onward, the sign lingering in his mind like a warning. Ethan's route led him over a series of aging bridges, where the cityscape vanished beneath layers of darkness and fog. His thoughts wandered to the legends of the city. The ghostly hitchhikers and cursed roads whispered about in hushed tones by older residents. His rational mind scoffed at such tales, yet the atmosphere felt charged with something unseen, something malevolent. Passing through a tunnel, the temperature in the car dropped suddenly. The interior seemed to fill with an oppressive stillness. As the car's interior lights flickered, a shadow slipped across the back seat. Ethan jerked in his seat, his heart pounding. He glanced in the rearview mirror, only to find his own reflection staring back, albeit with an expression that was not entirely his own. A faint, almost sorrowful smile that lingered too long before vanishing. The radio, now louder than before, emitted a series of barely audible whispers. At first, he thought they were merely a trick of the static, but then he distinctly heard his name. Ethan. Echo through the confined space. The sound was soft yet insistent, as if beckoning him to heed a warning he couldn't yet understand. Emerging from the tunnel, Ethan found himself on an unfamiliar stretch of road. The familiar glow of streetlights was replaced by an unbroken darkness, punctuated only by the intermittent gleam of his headlights on wet asphalt. It was then that he saw her. A figure standing at the roadside. A woman dressed in a tattered white gown, her hair cascading like a broken veil. Her eyes, dark and unblinking, seemed to pierce through the veil of night. Ethan's pulse quickened. He slowed the car, torn between the urge to stop and the primal instinct to flee. The woman did not move, nor did she utter a single sound. In that suspended moment, the air thickened with a palpable dread. As he inched forward, the woman dissolved into the fog, leaving behind only the haunting memory of her forlorn gaze. Shaken, Ethan resumed his journey, his mind racing with questions. Had he imagined the encounter? Yet, as he drove on, unexplainable events began to unfold. His car radio, now seemingly possessed, shifted channels on its own, cycling through eerie transmissions. A mix of static, whispering voices and fleeting snippets of old news reports about accidents on that very road. The GPS, usually a reliable guide, faltered, rerouting him repeatedly through labyrinthine alleys and loops that defied logic. Street lights behind him began to extinguish one by one, as if the night itself was swallowing the light. In the rearview mirror, Ethan noticed something far more disturbing. His reflection was no longer mirroring his every movement. At times it lagged behind, displaying subtle differences. A twitch of the mouth, a glint of something in the eyes. These discrepancies gnawed at his sanity, sowing seeds of paranoia that grew with each passing minute. The car's interior grew oppressive. Soft knocks, gentle yet insistent, began echoing from the dashboard, then from the seats. Ethan's hands tightened around the steering wheel. Every nerve in his body screamed for escape, yet the car continued its relentless, looping journey. The world outside transformed into a series of monochrome images. The spectral figure of the woman reappeared on the roadside, the fog swirling around the remnants of abandoned billboards, and distant shapes that seemed to follow his every turn. In a desperate bid to regain control, Ethan pulled over onto a desolate road. He stepped out into the biting cold of the night. The sound of his footsteps on wet pavement was the only normality in an otherwise surreal landscape. As he turned to peer into the darkness behind him, he saw it, a long, unending line of headlights, all moving in unison toward him. Yet, when he blinked, the line vanished, leaving only the echo of approaching engines. Inside his car, the phenomenon persisted. The radio's whispers grew louder, merging into a single, mournful chorus. The voice, now unmistakably that of a lamenting soul, recited fragments of a story, a tragedy of love, loss, and betrayal. It hinted at a curse, a binding loop of endless torment for those who dared travel this forsaken road. Ethan's sense of time began to fracture. Minutes bled into hours, and the distinction between reality and hallucination blurred. Each turn of the wheel brought him back to the same spot, a crossroads marked by a rusted, abandoned bus stop. Here, the fog was denser, and the silence more profound. He could almost feel the presence of unseen eyes watching from the shadows. In a moment of eerie clarity, Ethan recalled a rumor from his childhood. A tale of a driver who vanished on a foggy night, only to be seen again years later, wandering the same roads as a ghostly specter. The similarities between that story and his current plight were too stark to dismiss as mere coincidence. Determined to confront the terror that had overtaken him, Ethan drove to a narrow, forgotten stretch of road. The car sputtered and came to a reluctant halt near a crumbling overpass. He stepped out, his breath visible in the frigid air. The oppressive atmosphere pressed down on him as if the night itself were alive and resentful. With every step toward the overpass, Ethan felt as though he were treading on the boundary between life and death. The sound of his heartbeat mingled with the distant echo of dripping water and the soft, almost musical hum of the radio emanating from the depths of his mind. Suddenly, the air trembled with a spectral presence, a figure emerging from the gloom. The entity was not like the fleeting specters he had seen before. It took shape, a gaunt, sorrowful figure cloaked in tattered garments, its eyes deep wells of unspoken agony. The entity's presence was overwhelming, a concentration of all the despair and isolation that had haunted the roads for decades. In that moment, Ethan felt an unbearable weight of recognition, as though he had been waiting for this encounter his entire life. The entity spoke not with words, but with an overwhelming sensation that flooded Ethan's mind. Images and memories that were not his own rushed through him. He saw flashes of a tragic accident on that very road, a collision shrouded in mystery, and the anguished cries of those left behind. The entity was a remnant of that tragedy, bound to the road by a curse of endless wandering and sorrow. In a harrowing realization, Ethan understood. He was not the first to be ensnared by this loop. He was merely the latest victim of a cycle that repeated itself, an endless loop of despair and death. The chilling possibility struck him with force. Perhaps he had already succumbed to the curse, his soul tethered to this desolate highway long before his conscious mind began to question reality. Desperation surged through him. He demanded answers, his voice trembling as he pleaded with the apparition. In response, the entity's eyes softened for a brief, tragic moment, conveying the truth of its existence. Ethan saw his own reflection within the entity, a mirror of his soul tainted by the inevitability of fate. The revelation was as gut-wrenching as it was inescapable. The boundary between the living and the dead had dissolved long ago. In one final heart-stopping moment, the entity extended a spectral hand. Ethan, driven by equal parts terror and a yearning for release, reached out. The contact was like plunging into icy water, an electric shock of despair and clarity. Suddenly, the world fractured around him. Ethan found himself back in his car, the engine idling silently on that same deserted road. The fog was lifting, and the oppressive atmosphere had given way to an eerie calm. For a fleeting second, he dared to believe that it was over, that he had broken free of the loop. Yet, as he glanced in the rearview mirror, the same sorrowful smile returned, a reflection that now held the weight of infinite regret. In a state of disoriented disbelief, he pressed the accelerator, desperate to outrun the nightmare. But no matter how fast he drove, the road stretched infinitely ahead, bending back upon itself like the coils of a serpent. Every turn led him back to the crumbling overpass, every mile a reminder of his entrapment. Dawn broke with a reluctant light that filtered weakly through the fog. Exhausted and haunted, Ethan's eyes were heavy with the realization that the loop would never end. As the first rays of sunlight painted the horizon in mournful hues, a single truth crystallized in his mind. The nightmare was not a temporary aberration, but his eternal fate. In a final twist of cruel irony, the scene shifted. A disoriented Ethan awoke in a stark, unfamiliar room, drenched in sweat and shivering with residual terror. The room was dim, lit by the cold light of a television set broadcasting a late-night news report. The report detailed a decades-old mystery, a series of disappearances on that cursed road, with photographs of a young man whose face bore a striking resemblance to his own. A chill swept over him as he realized the horrifying implication. The story he had just endured was not merely a hallucination or a transient dream. It was a legacy, a loop that had claimed countless souls before him, and he was now an inseparable part of its dark continuum. The photograph in his trembling hand confirmed it. His face, aged by sorrow and etched with the terror of endless nights, stared back from a grainy image of a car abandoned on that very road. The television flickered one final time, and the voice of the news anchor, calm yet sorrowful, delivered the final, inescapable truth. Authorities continue to search for the missing driver of car number. The announcement trailed off, leaving an unsettling silence that resonated with the finality of fate. Ethan's eyes widened with the dawning horror of his own immortality. A prisoner of the midnight loop. The revelation was absolute. There was no escape from this cycle of despair. No return to the life he once knew. In that bleak, unforgiving moment, the boundaries between life and death, reality and nightmare collapsed entirely. The night's terror had not been confined to a single moment, but had woven itself into the fabric of Ethan's very existence. The cursed road, the ghostly hitchhiker, the looping nightmare, all were threads in a tapestry of eternal suffering. And as the city of New York began its slow awakening to another day, somewhere in the labyrinth of fog and deserted highways, Ethan Reyes continued to drive, a silent, spectral figure trapped in a relentless, haunting loop. The story of Ethan Reyes serves as a grim reminder that some roads are not meant to be traveled, and some mysteries are best left unsolved. In the dead of night, when the familiar world fades into shadows, one can almost hear the whispered echoes of the lost forever bound to the endless, cursed highway of Midnight Loop, the highway of nowhere. The road stretched infinitely through the desolate Arizona desert, a 2-lane blacktop, cracked and faded, with no signs of life for miles. The only company was the endless rows of skeletal cacti and the occasional rusted-out husk of an abandoned car. It was past midnight, the witching hour, when the world fell silent and strange things happened on the road. The sky was starless, swallowed by thick, rolling fog that seemed unnatural in the dry desert air. The moon was nowhere to be seen. Jim Harper squinted through the windshield, his headlights barely cutting through the mist. He could hear the rhythmic hum of his truck's engine, the occasional rattle from the cargo in the back, and the crackling of the CB radio. Static, mostly. It was supposed to be an easy job, a straight haul from Flagstaff to a small town near the Nevada border. But the road ahead felt wrong. His GPS had rerouted him, guiding him onto a road he didn't recognize. The sign had no name, just an arrow pointing into the void. Still, a job was a job. Jim kept driving. Jim Harper was a man with too many miles behind him and not enough ahead. He was 48, a veteran of the road. Divorced, 2 kids he rarely saw, and a drinking problem that made sure he stayed awake even when he wanted to sleep. He had seen things out here, strange things, but nothing that had ever truly rattled him. Tonight felt different. His CB radio crackled. A voice, distant and distorted, whispered, "Turn back." Jim frowned. "Who's this?" Silence. Only the deep, suffocating static. He adjusted in his seat, gripping the wheel tighter. Maybe it was just his mind playing tricks on him. He hadn't slept in over 20 hours, and sleep deprivation did weird things to a man. First unusual event. The hitchhiker. Jim saw him up ahead, a man standing by the roadside, his face obscured by the fog. He had a backpack slung over one shoulder, his thumb out. Jim drove past without stopping. He never picked up hitchhikers. 5 minutes later, the same man was standing by the road again. Same backpack, same posture, same outstretched thumb. Jim's stomach turned. That was impossible. He gritted his teeth and kept driving. Second unusual event. The GPS malfunction. His GPS screen flickered, the road name changing from State Route 66 to unknown. Then it stopped giving directions altogether. When he tapped the screen, it rebooted. A single message appeared. No escape. Third unusual event, the rearview shadow. Jim checked his mirror. For a split second, he saw something sitting in his back seat. A dark shape, hunched, featureless. Then it was gone. His grip tightened on the wheel. "You're just tired, Harper, just tired." A light appeared in the distance, a gas station. The neon sign buzzed weakly, half the letters dead. It should have read "Last Stop Gas Diner," but instead it flickered "Stop" over and over. Jim pulled in. Inside, the air was stale. The place smelled like rotten meat and old coffee. The cashier, a thin, pale man, stood behind the counter, staring. He never blinked. Jim grabbed a bottle of water and approached the counter. The cashier didn't acknowledge him. Jim cleared his throat. "Hey, you open?" The man's lips moved, but no sound came out. Then Jim's eyes dropped to the clock on the wall. It wasn't moving. The hands were frozen at 3:14 a.m. Jim's gut twisted. He checked his phone. 3:14 a.m. The same time he left his last stop. Had time stopped? Then his eyes landed on the newspaper by the counter. The headline sent a chill down his spine. Trucker found dead on highway 50 years ago. Body never recovered. Beneath it was a photo of a truck. His truck. Jim staggered back, knocking over the water bottle. It shattered. The cashier finally spoke. His voice wasn't human. "You've been here before, Jim." Jim bolted back to his truck. Screw this, he fired up the engine and floored it. The road stretched endlessly. He should have hit another town by now, but the gas station appeared again. He was trapped in a loop. His CB radio crackled. Then he heard his own voice. "Jim, you have to listen, you're already dead." He slammed on the brakes. His breath came in short gasps. A shadowy figure sat in the passenger seat. Jim turned his head slowly. The figure had his face. But it was wrong. Its eyes were hollow, its mouth stretched too wide. It leaned in and whispered, "You never left that gas station, Jim." Jim screamed. Jim hit the gas, speeding toward the horizon. The world warped around him, the fog closing in like a suffocating blanket. Then he saw it. A sign up ahead. "Welcome to Black Hollow, Esther, 1953. He had seen that sign before. It was the last thing he saw before he died. His memory rushed back. The crash, the fire, the smell of burning metal and flesh. He had died on this road 50 years ago. And now, he was just another ghost on the phantom route. Jim gasped awake, his hands white-knuckling the steering wheel. His heart thundered in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Outside, the neon sign flickered in the darkness. "Stop! Stop! Stop!" He was back in his truck, parked in front of the gas station. The windshield was covered in a thin layer of dust, as if he'd been sitting there for hours, or years. Jim's hands trembled as he reached for his phone. 3:14 a.m. His gut twisted. No. No, no, no. The clock on the gas station wall neighed 3:14 a.m. The date on the newspaper. Still from 50 years ago. His truck engine was still running, the low rumble filling the silence. He checked the side mirror. The road was empty. No cars, no people. Just the same eerie, endless fog stretching into nothingness. Slowly he turned toward the gas station. The cashier was still there, still staring, still not blinking. Jim's breathing grew shallow. He could still hear the echo of the last words the shadowy figure had whispered in his ear. "You never left that gas station, Jim." He swallowed hard, his mouth dry as sandpaper. Had he ever left? Had he ever been anywhere else? For a moment he considered starting the truck and flooring it down the road. But what if he ended up right back here again? A soft static crackled from his CB radio. A voice, his own voice, whispered, "Jim, wake up." Jim's pulse spiked. He reached for the radio, hesitated, then pressed the button. "Who's there?" His voice was hoarse, more static. Then the same voice, his voice, but more distorted. "You have to wake up, Jim, before it starts again." Jim's blood ran cold. Before what starts again? A gust of wind rattled the truck. The headlights flickered. The gas station door creaked open, and the cashier finally blinked. Ethan Carter never believed in ghosts. He thought they were just small-town nonsense, stories people told to make life more interesting. But that was before he drove down Blackwater Road. It started with a phone call. "Dude, my car's dead." Jake's voice crackled through the line. "I'm stuck on Blackwater Road." Ethan sighed, rolling his eyes. "Jake, that road's barely even marked on the map. What the hell are you doing out there?" "Taking a shortcut," Jake muttered. "Look, just get here fast, okay?" The call ended abruptly. Ethan grabbed his truck keys and headed out. The road was long and empty, flanked by thick, dark swamp on either side. The further he drove, the foggier it became. The radio started acting up, jumping between static and old country songs he was sure weren't even playing anymore. Then, suddenly, the police lights appeared ahead. Sheriff Daniels stood beside his cruiser, arms crossed. His face was grim. "Turn around," he said. Ethan frowned. "What?" "You don't want to be here, son. Not tonight." "I'm just picking up Jake." Daniels exhaled, tapping his fingers against the hood of Ethan's truck. "If you see someone on the side of the road, don't stop." A long silence. Then, he stepped back. "You already made your choice." Ethan drove past him, shaking his head. The sheriff had always been a little off. But then he saw her. A woman in white stood at the edge of the road, her back turned. She was barefoot, her long black hair tangled and wet as if she had just crawled out of the swamp. Ethan's fingers tightened on the wheel. He didn't stop. He didn't even slow down. But the moment he passed her, he felt something shift. And then she was in his rearview mirror. Her face was pale, her eyes black voids. Her lips barely moved, but he heard the words in his head. "Take me home." Ethan slammed the brakes when he saw Jake's car. Jake was already outside, waving his arms. "Ethan, something's wrong. My phone won't work, my car's dead, and I..." Then he stopped. "You see her, right?" Ethan didn't answer. The woman stood in the distance, facing them now. Jake took a step back. "We need to go now." Ethan jumped into the driver's seat and turned the key. Nothing. Then the truck locked itself. The radio started playing a soft, familiar melody. Ethan knew that song. He just didn't know why. The woman was now closer. Jake was bleeding from his nose. His breath turned ragged. "Something's wrong." The temperature in the truck dropped. The woman spoke again, her voice inside their heads. "Take me home." Ethan gritted his teeth. "Where?" She pointed ahead. There was nothing ahead, just more swamp. An old abandoned motel appeared out of the fog. It shouldn't have been there. The Blackwater Motel. The neon sign flickered. The parking lot was cracked and overgrown. It looked like no one had been inside in decades. But the front desk light was on. Inside sat Mr. Lewis, the motel's only living resident. He was old, gray-haired, and he didn't even look surprised to see them. You boys should have never stopped for her. Ethan's mouth was dry. Who is she? Lewis slid an old newspaper across the counter. Missing Sarah Collins. Ethan's blood ran cold. He knew that name. He had loved that name. Sarah had been his girlfriend years ago. She had vanished without a trace. She never left town, Lewis murmured. The radio in the motel crackled to life, and Ethan heard his own voice through the static. I made a mistake stopping for her. No matter which road they took, they ended up back on Blackwater Road. The truck wouldn't start. Sarah's song wouldn't stop playing. Jake was losing it. I'm not dying out here, man. He ran into the swamp. Ethan chased after him. And then the ground opened up. Jake screamed as hands reached from the mud, clawing at his legs, pulling him down. Ethan grabbed him, pulling hard, but something was stronger. Then the woman in white stepped forward. Her face changed. Sarah. Ethan's hands went limp. Sarah. Her expression softened. I just need to go home, she whispered. Ethan turned. And then he saw it, the wrecked car, half buried in the swamp. Her car. The truth crashed down on him. Sarah had never disappeared. She had died here. She had tried to escape, crashed, and drowned in the murky water. No one had ever found her body. And now she could never leave. Until someone took her home. Tears burned Ethan's eyes. He dug through the mud with his hands, pulling her remains from the wreckage. The air shifted. The road was clearing. The fog lifting. Sarah smiled, tears streaming down her pale face. Home at last. She faded into the wind. Jake coughed, gasping for air. Ethan pulled him up, shaking. It was over. The road stretched ahead, empty and silent. Ethan exhaled, and then he saw it. Another woman in white standing by the road, waiting for the next driver to stop.